Good afternoon, everybody. Why don't we begin? As people continue to come in. Hello. Let's begin, if we could, please. Welcome to Grand Rounds. This is a very special occasion. It is the Collier Visiting Professor, and I'm really pleased to welcome a friend of the department, Dr. Pat Areán, and I'll come back to Pat in a moment after letting you know just a couple of business arrangements. You'll know that there are continuing education credits available for this, and at the end, near the end of the talk, you'll see a QR code, I think, that'll take you to the form that you'll fill out in order to get those continuing education credits. And there also will be an opportunity in a day or two to click on a link in your email and do the same. Also, for those who are joining us online, virtually, please remember to generate questions and put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen rather than the chat box, which we use for operational functions for the presentation. So thank you for doing that as well. So this is a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Pat Areán. Just a little bit of background on Pat. Pat got her doctorate in clinical psychology from Fairleigh Dickinson University, and then went from there to UCSF to do a research postdoctoral fellowship, and remained there on the faculty, rising to the position of professor over a number of years till 2015, when Pat then moved to the University of Washington as a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, which was something of a real earth-moving experience in the field of geriatric psychiatry and many other fields, actually, because Pat actually bridges a lot of different fields. And let me mention that again in just a minute. In 1923, however, she left the University of Washington after having directed what's called an Alacrity Center, which was one of the big NIMH center initiatives. But moved from there after having created something very special in that center to the National Institute of Mental Health, where she took the position as director of the NIMH Division of Services and Interventions Research until 2025, last year, when she left that position, and is now helping to educate us all about all the processes involved in conducting really the very best and most needed research that we have in this country. She's a leading behavioral scientist with expertise in a number of areas, and let me just read them because it's sobering. Mental health services research, intervention, integration into health and school systems, digital mental health and clinical trial design. Also, she's an expert in cross-cultural mental health, in social determinants of mental health, in that context, geriatric psychology, and the assessment and treatment of depression and anxiety. She uses human-centered design for adapting psychosocial interventions and in the use of technology to conduct surveys that user experience research and clinical trials can then take to scale. She's had innumerable federally funded grants. She is the author of over 200 peer-reviewed publications, as well as chapters and books. And during her tenure at NIMH as director of Division of Services and Interventions Research, she worked very closely with members of FDA, CMS, SAMHSA, ASPE to develop pathways for transforming evidence-based treatments into health systems, and use digital technologies and AI in order to help facilitate those transitions and move our whole health system into 2026 and beyond. There's just a ton of different agencies that she is very, very familiar with and worked very closely with over the years. Let me just end by noting two things that, well, there are many things that strike me about the arc of Pat's career. One of them is that each of her research areas represents a real example of what we call the progress of science. That is, how the best science progresses over time, each iteration building on what she has helped to establish as best practice or the best evidence that precedes it and moves the field continually forward. And the second is that one doesn't do that kind of research alone. Pat is all about team science. She's about collaborations that draw in a wide array of disciplines and expertise that complement her own, and making the whole, pretty much whatever she does, greater than the sum of its parts. She's a visionary leader in our field, and very pleased to welcome her to the podium. Pat.
Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you for that really lovely introduction, Yates. It's a real pleasure to be here. My talk today, I'm going to share with you my insights as a former NIMH employee and division director about the future of services and interventions research, plus some new information I have from my friends who are still at HHS, which I've learned now here, talking to colleagues that we now refer to as, what is it again? The Mayday. If anybody's familiar with The Handmaid's Tale. Okay, so so these are basically my disclosures. Since I left NIMH in April of last year, I've been serving as a consultant on conducting effective clinical trials research to these organizations, as well as to individual investigators. I won't be talking that much about the work that I do with AI or community-based participatory research, because I really just wanted to focus on how to survive the next couple of years as a researcher. So my talk will focus on the gap in impact analysis I led while I was at NIMH, when I was the division director of services and interventions research. And while it's very hard to predict what will happen to NIMH and research it supports in the future, it is possible to make some predictions for this next year and potentially years beyond on how NIH supports research currently, and the work that DISR was, or the division that I led, was conducting research prior to the change of leadership at HHS and NIH. There have been some structural changes. For instance, all peer review is now centralized. So meaning that if you were funded by NIMH, you would be familiar that that NIMH had their own study sections. Those are gone. They don't exist anymore. However, reviewers who worked on those study sections have been incorporated into centralized review. So there's also no more pay lines, meaning that funding decisions, in my opinion, will be based less on one score and percentile, and more based on mission alignment with NIH. Okay, so that's a difference. Again, some of us who've been funded by NIMH already kind of used to this, because there was really no pay line or cut score that NIMH used for a number of years. And it was sort of the discretion of the division director and the institute director about what would be funded. However, that was based on science and not so much on political decisions. To this end, I will be discussing the future of health disparities and interventions research, and what my division was planning on supporting before I left, and how to make that align with RFK's vision. So let me first address the concerns many of us have about science in the US. The main questions that are in people's minds are, what is the future of HHS and is proposing for NIH structurally? How Congress is responding to that future, and what was proposed in 2024 for NIMH. So note that NIMH only has an acting director currently. And while there was a completed search for a permanent director, it's unclear if an offer was extended. I know somebody who was on the search committee and said it was a pretty chaotic process. So I don't know if we're going to have an acting director for the next year. Some of the plans that my division put into action will go forward. Some of them will be on the back burner. And I have a feeling that some will never see the light of day unless there'll be some modifications to what we proposed. So HHS, or Jay Bhattacharya, who is the NIH director, proposes to consolidate 21 institute centers and offices into 7, with cancer, aging, and infectious disease staying whole. However, NIMH is proposed to be merged with the National Institute of Drug Abuse and NIAAA, with Bhattacharya seeing behavioral health as one facet of a mission to combat chronic illness. So, for instance, how does depression contribute to the function of obesity? How does exposure to violence impact cognition and cognitive decline? So a lot of the research that you might, or announcements that you might see coming out of NIH will probably have this chronic illness underpinning as part of the mission. All NIH directors come to the job with a specific agenda. For instance, Monica Bertinoli, who is the previous director, was interested in creating learning health systems throughout the United States to focus on understanding the etiology of all illnesses, to create real-world test beds for novel treatments, and health services research to support the implementation of best practices. This didn't mean she wasn't planning on funding basic science. It just meant that any additional money that Congress appropriated to NIH would be spent on these missions, and she would have what's called a common fund, or a bucket of money that's specific to the NIH director to write, special announcements. So, however, the NIH director does need congressional approval for everything they make a decision about. Congress has been historically highly supportive of NIH, with the exception of a few periods in our history. During George W. Bush, there was a push to decrease the amount of funding focused on HIV prevention, largely because of key terms that offended members of Congress. And also, obviously, during COVID, when there was a lot of anxiety or anger at Anthony Fauci for the information he was providing about COVID. However, Congress has been very supportive of NIMH in particular. So if you look at NIMH's past budget, you'll see that since 2017, NIMH has had an increase in its budget, with the exception being when there's been a continuing resolution. And in 2024, there was a motion to increase NIMH's budget by $70 million focused on youth mental health. The NIH director, however, proposes a $40 billion reduction in the budget to NIH, an action that no one or very few people in Congress wanted or requested. And because of the massive pushback from Congress, it's unlikely that NIH will be reduced so drastically. And if it happens, there will probably be a big fight over that. Moreover, it will take a long time to implement these changes. In fact, in January, the House voted to give NIH a slight increase to accommodate the cost of living. So technically, that's considered level funding. But it was a clear rejection of Bhattacharya's proposal. The bill also, too, protected the indirect rates that universities could ask. So that's another, kind of evidence that that Congress is not in support of what RFK and Jay Bhattacharya are trying to do to health sciences in the United States. Now, even though Congress is fighting back with, pretty proactively against these changes, it doesn't mean that there won't be attempts to try to force Congress to reduce the budget of NIH or make future justifications to reduce its size. So with this backdrop in mind, let's put on our positive thinking caps and turn to the future of clinical and services research. So I'm going to start with what was in play before the change in leadership and then comment on what HHS appears to be interested in pursuing. So the first thing I did when I was an NIH division director was to look at our funding success relative to other divisions. So NIMH currently has 5 divisions and a couple of offices, but the primary divisions are the Division for Basic and Neural and Biological Sciences, the Division for Treatment Research, and then, translational research, and then the division I led, which was services and interventions. And a big takeaway for me was that each year, my division received about 400 to 500 applications total from the field, whereas the other 2 divisions received 500 per cycle. Each division got that much, so about 1,000 applications per cycle. In other words, very few people were submitting, and I suspect it is because that the proportion of researchers in effectiveness, implementation, and policy sciences are just smaller than they are in other fields, and that's partly by communication from previous NIMH directors about a lack of emphasis or interest in those areas. However, although the application numbers were lower than other divisions, success rates were about the same, with my division for being able to fund about 22% of the scored applications we received, which was similar to the overall funding success at NIH. So I wanted to better understand what was going on. Was it a dearth of people in the field that were applying to NIH, or were there barriers that NIMH was putting in front of people's ability to submit applications? So in those 18 months I was a director, I decided to do a gap and impact analysis that would get at what these challenges are that the field faced in submission and review. And during that time, I also tried to make a lot of connections with other agencies like the FDA and the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation and SAMHSA, so that we could create new kind of partnered research programs that might encourage people in other fields who wouldn't normally submit to NIMH to be encouraged to do so if we did these partnership kind of awards. I also try to open the communication channels with the research community. One of the things I found about particularly the division I was leading is that they were very close-mouthed about what the division was interested in. They felt it wasn't their job, which I disagreed with because my program officers and other divisions always communicated with me. And so I really wanted to hear from the community, be really transparent about all of the actions that we were going to take so that people would feel encouraged to come to us with their research ideas. To do that, I needed to get a good sense of what areas of science our division had funded well, and thus probably didn't need to do much more research on what we were not funding that we should have funded, and basically where the gaps were and what the barriers to submission would be. And so basically what I did was 3 things. Well, actually 2 I got to finish, but one was a request for information from the field, and I'll explain what that is. The second was an internal portfolio review of applications and awards since 2015. And so we wanted to dig in to see like what happened at review. Like were people not scoring well? Why were things not scored, et cetera? And then Josh Gordon, who was the NIMH director at the time, gave me $500,000 to contract with Westat to conduct an external portfolio review of our research and its impact on the field. Like how much of what we were funding actually turned into policy or became integrated into, a health plan. So the request for information is basically, what we tried to do is get a sense of what does the field think about the NIMH's experimental therapeutics requirement. And just to be really clear, back in 2016, it became a requirement for anybody submitting clinical trials of any kind to NIMH that they had to have a hypothesis that tested target and mechanistic, or target engagement of an intervention. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. I also wanted to know from the field what outcomes they felt were most important for us to be measuring, because that very much impacts uptake of interventions. As an example, I have a good friend who was the vice president of research and development for Optum. And she said most of the data that we collected weren't necessarily the data they needed to make a decision to implement a new intervention. Things like productivity and absenteeism are usually missing from our trials, as well as the cost of implementation of the intervention that we're proposing to them. So, and then I also wanted to get from the field what areas of science we've addressed well and what was needed. I note here that NIH does not permit staff, and I was staff, to conduct surveys. So I couldn't ask any yes/no questions or quantitative, surveys. We could only do requests for information, and all questions have to be open-ended, which meant that I had to employ qualitative research methods. So I had I had 3 staff members who had masters in public health, who had an expertise in qualitative research, and we used a grounded theory approach using iterative, review of the comments, which resulted in our final themes that I'm about to show you. So despite my constant nagging to please fill out this RFA, I contacted everybody I knew, and I said, contact everybody you know, and I know you did it. Thank you. Well, I don't know because it was, anonymous, but I got about 55 respondents who were clinicians, researchers, patients and families, and community organizations like Mental Health America. Most of the responses came from scientists, though. And 55 for a qualitative study is actually a decent sample size. You do reach saturation at some point, but you do have to take what I'm about to tell you with a little bit of, a caveat, because I doubt that there are only 55 such respondents in the US who would be impacted by the decisions made by the division I was leading. Let me talk about the experimental therapeutics approach. I talked about how it was a requirement. One of the big things that was really challenging about services research is that, the experimental therapeutics requirement when you're developing a new intervention to treat a disease in an organism, that makes total sense. But organizations are not organisms, and most of the interventions that are developed to implement a best practice or to improve the quality of care are multifaceted, they're complex, and they're highly practical. So it's hard to find a theory, right, as to why collaborative care increases the quality of care. In fact, there are 3 main ingredients of collaborative care. One of them is having a care manager, and that care manager is in there to address the fact that primary care providers don't have time to do high quality psychiatric care. Now, introducing the care manager introduced more time in primary care to address that problem, but it didn't do anything to change the amount of time that the primary care doctor had. So it sort of logically didn't make sense to be testing the mechanisms in a services intervention in the same way that we would be testing mechanisms in an organism where you're targeting a specific neural network or biological variable or even behavior. So anyway, that was my bias, and I tried to write the question in an unbiased way. And what we found is that most people felt that the experimental therapeutics had a purpose, but mostly in treatment, development, and efficacy testing. But they felt that this approach was not seen as necessary in effectiveness, implementation, or services research. They felt it was certainly nice to have. So if you could think of one, by all means, test it. But it requiring those hypotheses sometimes really didn't make sense, and it made it very difficult for people with good ideas to get past review. People did agree that it's not a good idea to have a black box. That we should know how things work, but by the time you're implementing an intervention, you should probably have data on whether and how that intervention works. Understanding how a system-level intervention works is important, but for many, it's not the most critical question to answer. Critical questions are things like access, reach, cost, and feasibility of implementation. In this question, we asked what outcomes are most important to collect. Here, most of the responses were pragmatic, for instance, placing value on the implementation outcomes over clinical. So again, cost, access, reach, better understanding of who responds under what circumstances, so more moderation research. They thought that was very much missing from the field. And more functional outcomes, such as, presenteeism, absenteeism, the ability to go to school. And what was the return on investment when implementing any best practice and they basically said we need more pragmatic trials. In terms of the future directions for research, respondents gave a lot of helpful ideas about what the division should fund, with the top 3 areas being health equity research, research that encourages better community or systems engagement, and digital mental health and measuring the impact of social determinants of mental health stability, such as housing first interventions tied for third. So based on these findings, one of the things we did was to make changes to how we fund applications. Now, this was sort of the first change we made was less based on the RFI, but more based on sort of an internal portfolio analysis we did. And one of my program officers, Mary Rooney, who oversees the prevention portfolio at NIMH, basically said, pointed out the R34, the pilot mechanism, hasn't changed in decades. And it isn't enough money to fund an adequate pilot trial for clinical trials. And so what we decided to do was to increase the the budget for those pilot trials. Now, we couldn't increase the budget in an R34. Mechanisms at NIH are tied to budgets, and one institute or one division can't make the decision that my R34s are going to have this much money. So we worked with grants management in our institute, and we came up with using a modular R01 to support pilot trials. And so what this does is it gives you a capped $250,000 a year with 3 years maximum to conduct your pilot. I'll note here that I got a lot of pushback initially from the training POs because they felt that the R34 was often the first award that junior faculty got. However, when we did our internal analysis, we found that we didn't fund more R34s than we did R01s. In fact, the reviews were just as stringent for R34s, but just for very different reasons, right? I also argued that it's kind of nice to come off of your K and get an R01. That helps with your promotion and it helps lower the age which the first R01 is awarded, which has been a lifelong mission for NIH. The second big change we made was to move the services trials to separate it out. Like the original announcement was just an R01 for effectiveness, services, implementation. It was all in one big announcement. And I was like, we're going to take the services and implementation trials and we're going to put them in a different mechanism and separate them out from the other, like confirmatory efficacy and the effectiveness studies. And I did, and in working with grants management, what we wanted to do was come up with sort of a phased approach to fund it. They recommended the R6133. Some of you may be familiar with this, but in this context, the R61 phase is to allow the investigator and the partnering organization to work out the kinks of the research partnership, because that is where a lot of these studies tend to kind of fall apart. And so if they needed time to integrate a measure into the electronic health record, or they needed to come up with a way to make sure that they can enhance the recruitment of a certain population, that they would have the time to do that. And then they could move to the next phase, which is an uncapped R01 level award under the R33. The other reason I wanted to move it out of the other trials is because it would allow me the opportunity to then modulate the requirement for the experimental therapeutics, eventually removing it from those trials. Not saying you couldn't do it. I was just not going to have it as a requirement. Those, by the way, those PAs are still up there. So you can still apply to them. And the training that we did to help reviewers and applicants understand what we were trying to get at and changing the mechanisms and how to apply for the R6133 is still up there. I think if I go backwards, that link is the YouTube where we explain the process. So one change to be aware of is that eventually all applications sent to NIH will be in response to parent announcements, meaning that at some point in the future, NIMH, NCI, NIDA, they're not going to have their own announcements. Okay. What will happen is that there will be a general announcement, say for clinical trials, that all the institutes participate in, and each institute can write down what they want to see come to them or what kind of trials they'll fund. But the NIMH will no longer have a very specific announcement unless it comes down from the NIH director that your institute needs to study X, write a PA for that. It's clear that this is a move to make sure that all science is centralized under the NIH director. He has also been critical of institute directors being too involved in the direction of science, which he feels should come from the community and scientists themselves. I mean, you can't really disagree with that it should come from us. But institute directors are there to be sort of the guardians of science and, making decisions about where the priorities are. And he felt like that was too invasive. I do have a hard time squaring that decision with the budget increase from Congress. But so I would wait to see if these changes are going to come, going to happen. My colleagues have told me that they will, but they haven't heard anything. And that in all likelihood, everybody who applies to NIMH should just, if the PA is still up there, if the announcement's still on the website, just apply, because it'll count when you hit that review cycle. Okay. All right, so let's look at the internal portfolio analysis we did. Even with the news about the program announcements, there's still something to be learned from what NIMH has funded in the past and what the Institute should be supporting in the future. In order to better understand what my division had been focusing on, we dove into what had been funded in the last 10 years to understand where the opportunities were. Based on requests from Congress, my conversations with the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, and on the RFI data that I just shared with you, plus some of my own interests, the main areas we were going to start with in the first 3 years of my work there were to focus on youth mental health, health inequities, including research on older populations, and then focus on those living with food, financial, and housing insecurities. I was really interested in some of the programs like Housing First and some of the stipend interventions that people have been giving to people who are homeless to see what kind of impact that would have on the mental health system. So those are sort of the areas. And we use this grid to look into what we'd already funded in these 3 areas around these main priorities down on the left side or the left column, around what we've been doing in prevention and interventions, workforce research, what settings we had already been studying pretty well, what settings we haven't been studying. So for instance, with youth, we didn't fund a lot of research on juvenile justice, which I felt would be really important given some of the issues with having, say, police in schools versus having counselors in schools, and then systems or policy level research like value-based care, measurement-based care, methods for optimizing systems and financing models. So once we did that, I'll give you an example. Once we identified where our needs were, we basically populated this table, and this is an example of what we did for youth mental health. The reason why we focused on youth mental health first is because we were being told we were going to get about 170 to $100 million from Congress to focus on the youth mental health epidemic. And this table led to, so basically what we did was we tried to think about, like, what do we already focus on in youth mental health? What did we think were really pressing, urgent things we needed to focus on? So issues around social media consumption, impact of COVID, lockdowns in schools on educational and mental health impact. What things were also like urgent, like, you know, kind of not quite like we gotta, you know, I mean, important, not that, you know, not super urgent, but really, you know, we're getting a lot of, we need a lot of science around. What was interesting, but we need to collect more information, like hold, you know, a work group to discuss what we needed to do in that area. And then thinking about partners in HHS that we would work with to kind of extend the work that we were doing. We also talked about databases and computational approaches that might facilitate answering some of these questions, whether or not it fit the learning healthcare system mission that Monica Bertinoli was putting forward for NIH, and then what kind of literature out there that would support our rationale. And so these are examples. One is a PA, the other are two council concept clearances based on this review that we did. So this PAR is still up there. It is on accelerating solutions to improve access and quality of empirically supported practices for youth mental health. And if you read that announcement, you'll see there's a lot, all of those areas that I showed you on that table are represented in what we were looking for from investigators to submit to this PAR. The only difference is that we don't have the $100 million, but it is a very important area, and it's even one that you know, RFK and Jay Bhattacharya support. So there may be something in there that can be, you know, that will still make it through review. We had two concept clearances. One was advancing research on empirically supported interventions for older adults living with serious mental illness. This is based on a report that was commissioned, I think, by SAMHSA and the National engineer, I forget what it is, NASM, right? You know, had basically written that we have all these interventions, but they're not being implemented. And older adults living with psychosis are being really underrepresented. So we wanted to take that report. I worked with Joe Evans on that to create this concept. It's not been released as an RFA yet, as far as I can tell. We'll have to kind of wait and see whether or not it does get released. And then this other concept clearance, which I was really interested in, was optimizing treatment strategies for adults with attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. It was just based on some of the concerns Congress had about the shortage of ADHD medications. There's a huge review about whether or not this was the next opioid epidemic. FDA, Congress were reassured that no, it was not. You know, there was just some kind of a production supply chain problem. But this is one I think maybe might get released, but with a lot of modifications, because a lot of what we wrote in there is, are there behavioral interventions that could be tried on adults with this disorder that might be helpful for them and lower the need for having to rely on medication, which is way in line with RFK's vision for this kind of thing. So I'm going to quickly talk about interventions research. So we were responsible for things like researching promotion, prevention, early identification and intervention, and intensive interventions research. Keep in mind that RFK has a big say in the direction of mental health research. He is a person in recovery, and I believe it has based his perspective about interventions on AA and NA models, not to mention wellness and nutritional models that are largely considered to have little more than an N of 1 data for support. He has publicly stated his interest in the following. So alternative treatments for depression, which interestingly enough, as much as he's a antagonist towards antidepressants, he's totally full on board with psychedelics. So, you know, you try to square that for me one day. He's interested in lifestyle interventions for managing depression. So moving people off of antidepressants and into, say, exercise programs, nutritional psychiatry. How much sugar do you eat? Does it impact your, your mood? Methods to increase connection. So he's really into, he did a big talk to us at HHS when he first joined, and he talked a lot about the importance of community engagement, the impact of social isolation on substance abuse and mental illness. And so he's very interested in community-based interventions to support people with mental health conditions. And we assume he might be also interested in behavioral treatments, but I imagine it depends on how he defines that. As you all know, he's on a mission of deprescribing antidepressants in kids and ADHD medications. I'm worried he's going to start getting in on antipsychotics because of some of the comments he made in the press after a tragedy that happened with you all know, a young man who started an antipsychotic and killed his parents. This is very worrisome because he seems to make these policy changes before the science he himself has commissioned is done. You can see that from all of his decisions around autism. I suppose there's an opportunity to study the impact of these policy decisions on the mental well-being of the U.S., but it's probably not going to be funded by HHS. I have to find somebody else to fund you in that research. So I'm mindful of my time, and so I'm going to try to move a little bit ahead. So you're going to see me skip some slides. But one thing I wanted to address is that, Bhattacharya is basically putting RFK's vision into his mission with specific priorities focused around chronic illness, testing alternative treatments. He's really into replication studies and developing measurement and surveillance opportunities to better understand health treatment. So he's on a mission to create infrastructure and securing trust in science through community engagement and the use of computational tools as alternatives to traditional methods. So if we apply this to social determinants of health, there have been grave concerns, and I know that you already had somebody present on their experience of having to get an application through to funding. So I'll just reinforce, all that's happening. It's important to take a look at what Jay Bhattacharya himself has said about health disparities research, and really keep in mind when you're writing your applications how he wants to see the science look. He does say he's interested in understanding social determinants of health, but there's a call to be very measurement oriented. Not that we were never measurement oriented, but he's really emphasizing it. So if you look at this quote, for instance, he's fine if you want to look at redlining or housing discrimination and its impact on access to health services, and how it might impact different populations. But he doesn't want you to use terms like systemic racism, even though it's been pointed out to him, redlining is basically systemic racism. It's another, it falls under an umbrella of all those issues. He wants us to be able to measure factors like, to use really specific measures and terms rather than something general like systemic racism. He further says that NIH will prioritize research that goes beyond measuring health disparities to focusing on solution-oriented approaches. I'm a fan of that too. I think that, we probably are at a place where we could start looking at interventions to address systemic racism. And so that's that's promising to me. He's interested in implementing evidence-based practices into interventions. So a lot of what he's saying does sound like he's interested in services-oriented or implementation studies. But it's kind of hard to know exactly, because sometimes he says something like there's no banned terms, and then you find that there are banned terms. Things to avoid, and I'll get through this really quickly too. These are projects that he will absolutely not fund. And these are terms that he actually will want you to avoid. A new one is lived experience, by the way. You can't use that term. Somebody asked me why, and I said, I don't know, woke. You know, what you're supposed to use instead, people who have a history of mental illness, you know, I mean, whatever. This is not exhaustive at all. It's actually a couple of pages long since I made the slide. I encourage you to start following people who have been advising researchers on how to take their terms and get them past the algorithm that flags your application. I'm going to skip to that pretty quickly so you're aware of how that works. So this person is Tierney Richwood. This is her LinkedIn link, and I'm gonna you have access to these slides, so you know you should be able to write this down. But she's been providing people on LinkedIn these tables as examples of how to overcome the algorithmic barrier. And so as for this is another one, you know, rather than saying it's equity focused, you know, the potential alternative is measurable differences in a specific outcome, outcome gaps across a particular population or across population. So this is important too. I've started to hear some rumors that that the NIH will actually flag if you're focused just on Black youth or Hispanic populations. Bhattacharya has said is that you can do that, but you have to justify why you're focusing on that population. However, another rumor I heard is that people are coming back to the POs and saying, is this true? Is it true that Black youth are more likely to die in violent crimes? Right. And it's like, there's all the data, there's all the citations. Yeah, but is it true? Right. So it's a little, you know, it's a little suspect here. So a suggestion there is that you might have to add, you know, a comparator population in order to get past that algorithm. So I'm going to skip technology and just talk about the new application review process. This is how it works now. Everything is guided by Trump's executive orders, and he writes new ones all the time. So keep your eyes peeled for them. There are two parallel review tracks. There's scientific merit on this side, which we've always done. That's the peer review process. And then on the upper side is executive order alignment, right? So when your application is scored, it goes to the policy review, and they look through, using an algorithmic process, they flag terms or concepts that are misaligned with the executive orders. They send that to the institute director, who then sends it to the division and the program officers to say to ask 3 questions. And this was already happening, but this is way more organized than when I was there. The questions are, can they just remove the terms and still do the science with exactly the way it's written? And they test all their aims. And it's just a matter of like changing terms. If that's not the case, which of the aims can go, need to be removed, and how does that going to affect the budget? And if you can't remove the aims, you know, basically it's like impossible to do the study, then that application has to be basically returned to the investigator as not funded. And it doesn't matter what your score is. If you had a 15, you know, or a 10, you could still not pass that review and not be funded. Okay, so this is serious, which is why I'm emphasizing so much about make sure that you know, if you want to be funded in the next few years, kind of be really mindful about the terms, be really mindful about the how you describe what you're trying to do, find like a kind of common, you know, like mission that seems like it aligns with the executive orders. I will tell you a funny story. Whenever we had talked about executive orders, to staff, I kept calling them executive disorders. And it became like somebody's plaque when they were protesting, you know, stop the executive disorder. So So you can imagine, this is sidelined peer review to some degree, but there is a move to try to get peer review to also start to do this process. So there isn't so much effort at the policy review. So that's not great news. Also, you can see what the impact is on funding. So this is this website right here is a calculator based on reporter data that somebody at in NIH created and basically posted on Substack. I think it's not quite 100% accurate because when I put in some variables, it didn't make sense. Like they had some program officers having no awards, and I knew that they had some, but essentially it's close enough. So as you can see, the very top line is 2024, and you can see that there was a lot of funding, happening over, over time. With, and this is across the funding cycles. The blue line is 2025 and the red line is 2026. And just to show you what that means, this is May Council. That's the last review. And for 2026, so far NIMH has only funded 138 applications, whereas in 2024, they funded 301. Yeah, so we're leaving a lot of money on the table. And now there is a hope, Jay is supposed to spend the money Congress gives him, and he will get in a lot of trouble for not doing that. Now he can claim, well, all the applications we got were not meritorious, but there's going to be a fight about that. So there could be, I'm trying to look for upsides here, that for October Council, there might be a whole bunch that get funded and that line will go up again. But probably not to what previous years were, because that's going to be very difficult to do. People to follow, things to read. You should definitely read the White House website on improving oversight of federal grant making. That explains a lot of what they plan to do around funding awards at HHS. There is the NIH director statements about his mission, using a unified strategy to explain how he wants to fund research in the future. The third link is implementing the unified strategy through to guide consistent and clear award decisions. So all of that language is going to be there. Please get yourself familiar with it so that you can be competitive. But there are other things that are happening too. There's going to be decisions about who gets an award based on geographic distribution. So if you live in a state that gets a lot of NIH funds and another investigator lives in New Mexico where they don't, and it's the same idea, they'll get the grant. Okay. We've always been held to you can only have so much federal funding as an investigator. Very few of us ever reached that point. And so when we did, there was this merit award that you would get nominated for if you had a well-scored application that, was novel, and you could get you would go over the cap. There's no merit review awards anymore. The idea, I don't know how many awards an investigator can have, but there is a move towards reducing the number that you can have. And then there's actual needs and opportunities, which I don't know what that means, but those are all quotes from the unified strategy, by the way. That's in those documents. Okay, so I was really sad. I didn't want to make you all stressed out, but I do think it's important for you to be aware of what's going on. Because if you're waiting for an award, it's not necessarily that you're not going to get funded. It's just going through this ridiculous process of review that's slowing things down. You are probably in the future going to be asked to reduce your budgets, because they're going to say you don't need this, or why do you have so much money for recruitment? Anyway, and it's not you, it's not the science, it's the policies and where we're living in right now. So it's hard to advocate for ourselves when so much of our funding, so much of what we do depends on funding. But there have been instances where state partnerships have resulted in outcomes like correcting the indirect cap that was proposed, Those of us who are senior and no longer really need the funds should have the loudest voice out there, and band together to call out these injustices. And I do fear for NIMH. Out of all the institutes, they're funding the least applications. And so that's very troublesome. Anyway, so takeaways. And I think we have 5 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is just cut to the chase, because you know what the takeaways are, and see if you have any questions, or is there anything I can do to alleviate your anxiety? Maybe some quick problem solving treatment. I know, it's like, do I clap? I'll let that all sit there for a moment.
Yeah. Hey, Steve, how do we know whether there are online questions?
Oh, okay.
We do have online. We have a question. The question is, where can we find the list of terms that we're not able to use?
Well, they're not posted on the NIH site, but I can send you some links where they are posted. So there's a number of, the person I mentioned, Kearney Richwood, she has the list of terms and she will send them to you for free. Substack has posted a lot of those terms. There's actually a few federal Substacks or NIH Substacks. These are people who used to work at NIH who quit but still have contacts, and they're doing all of the dissemination of these practices.
We have another comment from Dr. Kane, who says the current situation underscores the need for strong mentoring and institutional support programs for early career investigators, period.
Yes.
So,
Thank you, Eric.
Okay, great. Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that those of us, I mean, you know, this is, you know, the 1990s on steroids when we did this with George W. Bush, because he didn't have the infrastructure within NIH to, you know, implement these like term cleansing, you know, practices. But people who did HIV research had to do this for a couple of years in the early 2000s, I'm thinking. Yeah, that's George W. Bush. I'm way too old. I'm blending centuries, decades now. But they had to do that for a while, and then it kind of calmed down. I'm not sure we're at the calm down phase, but, you know, depending on how things happen in the midterm elections and how unpopular RFK and Jay Bhattacharya are with Congress, it is possible that they may be impeached, right? I hope. Fingers crossed. Yeah, Kim?
I'm not sure how to even word this question or if I should say it, but do you feel like we're getting to or have gotten to a point where we're making a Faustian deal by taking NIH funds? Is there a point at which we need to protest by not submitting?
I think it's too soon to do that. I think at some point, I don't know if cutting your nose off to spite your face is really the way to go. June within the network, I've been in contact with, I've been showing her sort of what's been posted on LinkedIn around like how to get around the algorithm. And her feeling is that don't do that. Submit your applications the way you want to. That's the best way to protest this. She's like, you give a bully a dime, he'll take a quarter next time. And I kind of try to explain to her, it's like, yeah, but they're not going to get funded, right? You know, they're going to get pulled. But she's like, yeah, but you need to do that to demonstrate what's happening. Like, you know, and you can take that data to your congressperson or to the help committee and show them that, you know, out of X number of investigators who have been funding these research questions that are very, very much aligned with like good definitions of the barrier you're trying to address, but they're focused in a Latino community and you got rejected because of misalignment, that then they can take that and, you know, beat it over the head with Jay. I was actually on a call recently with the staffers in Bernie Sanders, office who focus on health because he's the chair of the health committee, or he's the co-chair of the health committee. And so I was on the call with June, and it's not her name, by the way, but June was trying to show how he was really, now that he'd taken all the anti-vaxxers off of the autism advisory group, he's now have all of these unethical doctors who promote things like leucovorin treatment and bariatric chambers for children with autism. And their reaction was like, this is important for us to know, but we can't do anything until something happens, right? And they were like, we're sorry to say it, but he has to make a mistake for us to impeach him. We can't say you are making a mistake or this is wrong in this way. And it's just like, they were like, I'm sorry, but that's just how government works. So you have to let him fail. And I think that was what June was getting at, is that you have to, I don't think junior faculty should put themselves in that position, but senior faculty probably could.
Wondering, and last question, we have professional societies and organizations who do speak for science.
Yep.
What role should they play, and how do we?
They should absolutely be banging on congressmen's doors. They should doing all the lobbying the two APAs do for various reasons. That needs to change around and be focused on science. Not just science, but CDC issues and how the FDA is being run, but definitely NIH, because Congress is already on our side. They just need more ammunition to get things to change. So as an example, I shared that graph with Tom Insel, right? And he goes, I didn't know things were that bad. And I'm like, yeah, and he's like, I think I'm going to say something at APA. I don't know if anybody listens to him anymore, but I do think that, like, I know I was talking to Ben this morning, there is a gathering of psychiatry department chairs, and maybe that could be a topic of discussion. How do we push back against the fact that, science, health sciences is being damaged in this pretty significant way? Is there a way for the presidents of the different organizations to come together and lobby? But whatever lobbying power people have, they should use it for this purpose.
Okay, well,
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.